who's going to be talking about his book, The Fruitfulness of Normative Concepts. He's going to be introduced by Paige Ramino, who's a postdoc in the EMP Lab and the Prevention Research Center. So whenever you're ready, take it away, Paige.
Am I? Okay, there you go. Hi, thank you, Daryl. I'm Paige, and I get to introduce Matt today. So our next speaker is Matt Lindauer, and if you've had the chance to meet him, you already know he's one of the most genuine and kind people in his field. He got his bachelor's in philosophy from NYU and his PhD in philosophy from Yale in 2015. After that, he did a postdoctoral fellowship at the Australian National University. And now he is an associate professor of philosophy at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, where he also holds a psychology appointment and co-directs the Sci-Fi Lab. His work sits at the intersection of moral and political philosophy and moral psychology using traditional philosophical methods and empirical tools to ask questions about moral motivation, in addition to justice and a swath of related topics. He's published widely in journals including Philosophical Studies, Journal of Moral Philosophy, American Philosophical Quarterly, and journals like the Oxford Studies in Experimental Philosophy. I actually didn't know about that journal. That's really cool. His new book, The Fruitfulness of Normative Concepts, is out this year with Oxford University Press. The book asks whether philosophical concepts can do real work in the real world. His research team conducted the first experiments showing that philosophical arguments can motivate greater charitable giving, a finding that situates empirical science at the heart of moral philosophy itself. Please welcome Matt.
Thanks for such a kind and well-researched introduction. I'm very eager to speak here. Thank you for inviting me, Daryl, and thank you all for being here. I hope that in some ways you'll see what I have to say today as arguing that the kind of work that many of you all do outside of philosophy should be read more and engaged with more by philosophers rather than that other fields need to think more about philosophy. I think there's a lot of room for cross-pollination, but in particular, I'm arguing that philosophers can really benefit from, and philosophy as a field can benefit from more rich and deep engagement with work in the social sciences. And making that case to the field of philosophy, believe it or not, has not been especially easy. So that's why I wrote this book, and I'm hoping to make an intervention into the fields that I work in, which are mostly moral and political philosophy, and then moral psychology as well, where the going is a little less tough. Okay, so I'm going to start the talk with a motivating contrast to kind of get you to see the kind of thing that I'm getting philosophers to acknowledge. Philosophers like thought experiments, and I brought this up last night very briefly and informally in my my little event with others at Webster's Books. So imagine a hypothetical case where there's this universe much like ours, and scientists in this universe have just developed a new theory of the basic building blocks of the universe. The theory posits the existence of some atomic particles and describes their qualities and the principles that guide their behavior. It just turns out that this theory also has devastating military applications, and if the theory is disseminated, it's likely that very destructive weapons will wind up being used, putting many people and even human existence in danger. So in many ways, this world is much like our own, and Einstein's mass energy equivalence, of course, right? And then here's another case that's actually reminiscent of a real theory of justice, but consider this case. In a hypothetical universe much like ours, imagine that philosophers have just developed a new theory of justice. That theory is quite coherent and consistent and more wide-ranging than many other competing theories. However, the only downside is that if this theory is widely disseminated, the people who implement that theory will fail to take account of the pervasiveness of racism and racial inequality in their societies. And racism and racial inequality in these societies will increase substantially as a result. Now, not everyone might feel the difference between these cases, but these cases, at least to me and to many who read this work, seem to differ significantly. one way to put our finger on what's going on is that there's a difference in terms of whether facts about practical effects matter to the evaluation of the relevant theory. So in the scientific case, you might say, well, it's a true theory of the nature of subatomic particles in that universe. It's just unfortunate that it has these problematic implications. But it seems weird to say that about a theory of justice. If thinking about justice in a certain way leads to a lot of injustice, you might say that something is wrong in the house itself, right? The call's coming from inside the house. Now, if you're a thoroughgoing pragmatist, a kind of Christopher Hookway, Charles Peirce kind of person, you think that practical effects of all theories always matter to whether they're good theories, even in science, I'm going to say a few things about why I think that's not entirely right and that my theory bears on that debate. But even if you were this kind of thoroughgoing pragmatist about truth and scientific explanation, you might cast this difference. You might still be able to see a difference between what's going on in these two cases in terms of which practical effects matter and to what extent they do in the evaluation of the relevant theory. So these two cases are supposed to help motivate the idea that we want something different from theories of justice and theories of other normative concepts than we want from other kinds of theories. Okay. Many theorists hold the view that the normative concepts employed in moral and political philosophy, in addition to being coherent and well-motivated from a purely theoretical perspective, should be partly evaluated by the practical role that they play. And the extent to which moral and political concepts play their practical role well, I refer to as their fruitfulness, hence the title of the book. I'm borrowing this term fruitfulness from Rudolf Carnap, who is a philosopher of science and logician, but I mean something quite different by that term than what he meant, if anyone else is wondering. And notably, when I talk about normative concepts, I'm really here just referring to the normative concepts of moral and political philosophy. So concepts like justice, goodness, solidarity, empowerment, welfare. But of course, there are other ways of thinking about normativity that also include things like aesthetic concepts like beauty or expressiveness, and epistemic concepts like justification have normative components. But I'm really, just for the purposes of this talk, talking about moral and political concepts. Okay, so the fruitfulness of these concepts and specifications of them, and by this I mean the fruitfulness of norms, theories, and principles that fall under a given concept like justice. So competing conceptions of concepts, to use Rawlsian terminology, which you also see in some current work in cognitive science about conceptions of concepts from people like Jake Quilty-Dunn. The fruitfulness of these items can only be determined with the help of empirical investigation. In particular, determining whether or not a given moral or political concept will be fruitful in solving practical problems is a question that requires empirical evidence to answer. And hence, insofar as evaluating philosophical concepts is what philosophers aim to do, empirical research is required to address at least certain core philosophical questions. And you might, as many of you in this room do a lot of empirical research, you might be surprised to find that that's something that is hard-won territory in philosophy. But the idea is that through this fruitfulness route, you can get the conclusion that philosophers have to pay attention to empirical research and even be involved in conducting some in order to address even traditional philosophical questions. So this is part of the philosophical enterprise, not merely of side interest, right? We shouldn't just have a kind of dilettantish approach to engaging with empirical research. And when we look at empirical research, we're not kind of changing the subject in the way that P.F. Strawson accused Carnap of doing. He was interested in like the fruitfulness of various scientific and logical concepts. And Strawson said, well, that's kind of like handing a book on physiology to someone who says with a sigh that they're interested in the workings of the human heart. It's kind of like misunderstanding the subject matter. And I'm arguing that's not what we're doing when we turn to empirical research in these normative areas of philosophy. And that requires us to, in some ways, bridge the Izzat gap and some traditional questions about the distinction between descriptive and normative matters, right, that are quite tricky. So I'll try to do all that in 45 minutes. There'll be a lot left on the table, no doubt. So I break the theory up into 5 dimensions. I'd be interested in whether or not I've got the exhaustive list. But there are 5 ways in which moral and political concepts can be fruitful, and I call them motivational, prevention, resilience, consensus, and guidance fruitfulness. I first developed this framework in an article in 2020, and then the book is really extending and learning from criticisms of that article and providing some case studies in actual empirical research that I and others have done that bear on these kind of fruitfulness considerations. The second thing that the book really does is argues that these dimensions seem to be domain specific to the normative, that they don't really apply very well to purely scientific concepts. So the thought is if we're going to develop an account of fruitfulness that's accurate for these concepts, it must not overgeneralize. It must not claim that the same kinds of practical desiderata that apply to a concept like justice also apply to concepts like truth or justification, right? Or that they don't apply to scientific classificatory concepts like the concept planet or something like that, which have also been subject to practical evaluation. It's just not the same kind of practical evaluation. Okay. And this is in tension with much of the conceptual engineering literature, which is a literature that focuses on trying to change our concepts to have better effects in various ways. But they often, in this literature, talk about concepts en masse and don't distinguish between normative and non-normative concepts. So I'm trying to make an intervention into that literature in an urge to be kind of careful about this difference kind of way. Okay, so here's a quick outline of the talk. First, I'm going to motivate the account of fruitfulness. I'm going to raise some concerns about generalizing the account. I'm going to respond to some key objections, which is always super fun. Chapter 3 was the most fun to write because I take on like 10 or 12 objections or something. I just love doing that. I don't know what that says about me. And then I'll conclude with what I take to be the most important upshots of the view. So to motivate the account, right, the idea that morality or moral theory differs from other areas of purely theoretical reflection is not a new one. It goes back to a tension between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle held that we study ethics for a different reason than we study other areas of philosophy and subject matters. In Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he said, we're not conducting this inquiry in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good. He goes even further in the next phrase. It's often translated as, or else there would be no point to doing so. So he has this, I don't think that all work in moral and political philosophy has to be practically oriented in the way that that second phrase would suggest. But the idea is that the study of ethics has a point to help us figure out how to live our lives in the best way. And this is consistent with the thought that if we were sort of perfect beings, we would have no need for these concepts. There's this great quotation from James Madison in the Federalist Papers. He says, if men were angels, there would be no need for government. Well, I think there's a kind of parallel argument that you could run about the concept of justice. If we were perfectly altruistic beings, not subject to scarcity and envy and all the forces that lead to suboptimal human behavior, we might have no need for this, this domain of philosophy. So normative concepts, of course, concepts like justice and fairness arose in response to adaptive pressures related to the need for collective and cooperative living. And I think that we should think about the origins of these concepts and thinking about the roles that they play today and how we might also try to guide our thinking about those concepts to better solve these kinds of practical problems. They help us to live together with other human beings by aiding us in coordinating our behavior and cooperating with one another, hopefully better than we would without them. And there are some moral abolitionists like Richard Garner who think that actually moral thought on the whole is worse for humanity. So I'm trying to argue that that's not the case. As I said, moral and political concepts can be and often are evaluated in terms of their fruitfulness in my sense of the term, how well they help us to solve practical problems that we, in many cases, inevitably face as human beings. And in this sense, many moral and political philosophers are committed to the fruitfulness of normative concepts mattering to their evaluation, and in just this minimal sense are sympathetic to the Aristotelian understanding of the point of moral inquiry, without having to be Aristotelians in any deeper sense. Now, of course, there's another tradition in moral and political philosophy that eschews what I'm calling fruitfulness and aligns more closely with Plato's views than those of Aristotle that I've just mentioned. And according to this line of normative inquiry, moral and political concepts are no different from non-normative concepts like truth or planet, in the sense that the practical roles that they might play should be completely extrinsic to our evaluations of them. So I see G.E. Moore, Derek Parfit, Jerry Cohen, David Enoch, and David Estlund as real important representatives of this alternative view. And I'm not in this talk going to argue directly against this whole other way of looking at moral and political inquiry. In some ways, I see this as a fundamental disagreement about the point of normative inquiry. But I will say something. First of all, I'm going to motivate the alternative picture and try to show what we can get out of it, right? If we, the kind of proof is in the pudding is my approach, both here and in the book. It's very hard to take fundamental disagreements about methodology head on. But I introduce in the book, and this is why the pomegranate on the cover has a key in it, I introduce this lock and key metaphor to try to get at what I think is wrong with the alternative approach in a kind of gestural way. So suppose you think, with me and others, that normative concepts are solutions to practical problems. Well, you can think of them kind of then like keys that are supposed to unlock these kinds of problems, right? So this would open doors to cooperation and better living with one another, right? So maybe we have these early ideas of justice, and philosophers, through our theoretical work, we kind of refine those keys. You see how this key is like slightly more ornate than the one before it. Maybe it's better for handling. It actually is easier to turn a key with these kinds of details than it is to turn the kind of flat key at the beginning, and it's more interesting in various ways, more carefully designed. But if that's the case, if it's really the case that normative concepts are supposed to help us solve practical problems, one thing that can go wrong is the enterprise of key making, right, of designing these concepts, these normative concepts, and theorizing about them can become progressively divorced from the enterprise of opening locks, right? So now we wind up developing these very beautiful and intricate, ornate keys that really could open, as far as I can tell, no human lock, right? They couldn't really help us to solve any practical problems. And so again, this is not like a knockdown argument or something, but this is supposed to be an illustrative analogy for understanding where I think some moral and political philosophy can go wrong in becoming divorced from the kinds of practical problems that are the reasons why we should be engaged in this enterprise in the first place. So the dimensions of normative fruitfulness I talked about. There are 5 dimensions. I'm going to spend more time on 2 of them than I do in the book, but I'll give you some case studies of the kind of empirical research that I think bears on each of these dimensions. I think a lot of you do empirical research that bears on them too. So motivational fruitfulness. This is how people will act when they've internalized a certain concept, when they internalize a certain way of thinking about justice, or when they internalize a certain way of thinking about solidarity. What kind of behavior in the world does that lead to? It's not uncommon for philosophers to be concerned with evaluating moral and political concepts in terms of the effects that would result from their adoption. And in examining these effects, one natural question to ask is just how people will act when they internalize and employ concepts. So I take this to be behind, and interestingly, it's not always the case that critics of consequentialism are the most practically or empirically minded philosophers, but a classic objection to consequentialism is this self-effacingness objection. And it goes roughly like this. Consequentialism is the theory that an action is right only if it produces the best overall consequences in the world. That theory, though, if people internalize it, people are not good at calculating overall consequences, right? They're self-interested in kinds of ways. They'll deceive themselves into thinking that actions that are not optimal in this way, they'll delude themselves into thinking that they would be maximizing utility by adopting those actions. So consequentialism seems to recommend that people not be consequentialists because they'll do a bad job at doing so. And the objection is that that's a problem for a theory, that it recommends that people not internalize it, not use it as a decision procedure. Now, I'm not saying that's a good objection to consequentialism. There are many good defenses against that objection. But notice that the objection, I want to say, depends on thinking that it matters what happens when people internalize a theory. That's a necessary presupposition of the objection. Another area of philosophy that engages with this idea in a more robust way is in the literature on our duties to the global poor. This idea of motivational fruitfulness. So Peter Singer famously argued that principles of beneficence generate very stringent duties to help people in severe poverty in developing countries. So that's beneficence, helping, right? Duties of assistance, right? So if there's a child in a shallow pond in front of you, it'd be monstrous to just, oh, I'm late to the innovation hub. I'm not going to save that child's life. And it might ruin my clothes or something, right? But the thought is we're doing that all the time. We're ignoring the plight of children in developing countries, and for very little cost, we could be saving many lives. So we ought to do so. That's the kind of argument there. An alternative kind of argument from philosophers like Alison Jagger and Thomas Pogge argues that rather than just finding children in severe poverty in these other countries, we, through our governments, are actually pushing them into the pond in some sense. We're causally responsible for their plight. And along the lines of what you might be more familiar with if you're a psychologist, is like the act-omission distinction or doing-allowing distinction, those kinds of duties not to do harm rather than merely to help people who are in harm's way, generate are more stringent. So this is supposed to generate a stronger motivational commitment. And it's taken as a virtue of negative duties, in this literature, that they would be more motivating than positive duties. On the other hand, negative duties might not succeed in being more motivating because people might not find it plausible that as average residents of State College, that they're harming people in the global South in the same way that someone who pushed a child into a pond would be harming that child. So that might not, it might be a causal overstatement in some ways. I've done some work on the idea of enabling harm with my colleagues Christian Barry and Gerhard Overland, where that might be actually a better causal description of what's going on with affluent citizens of democratic Western governments and the global poor. So for a long time, this discussion was almost entirely speculative, but it had this nice virtue that people thought that it mattered whether or not their arguments regarding global poverty would actually motivate people to address global poverty. So it's a kind of nice test case for this idea of motivational fruitfulness. But now people are actually using empirical research methods to really examine these kinds of claims about the motivational effects of arguments. And I'll just run you through a couple of articles just very quickly trying to do this. So the first was mentioned by Page earlier on, compared the motivational fruitfulness of a Singer-style rational appeal, so kind of the shallow pond kind of argument, where we also included a kind of evolutionary debunking explanation for why we don't tend to think that children's lives across the world matter as much as the lives of children near us, and compared the effects of this kind of argument with what have been taken as kind of the gold standard emotional appeal types of ways of getting people to donate more and to care more about global poverty. So work by people like Deborah Small and Paul Slovic focused on identifiable victims. So these like Rokia studies, right? So we wanted to really give the arguments the best run for their money and see, could they do anything like motivating the same amounts of giving as emotional appeals? That really flew in the face of the way most people thought about moral motivation when we were working on this. And I won't spend a lot of time reading through this, but here's the text of the argument. It follows this idea that there are many children in severe poverty. The second paragraph talks about how much we would be willing to give to save a child dying in front of us, right? And then debunks the idea that there really is a morally important difference between the importance of the lives of children right in front of us and children across the world. And so we have very stringent duties to give. So people really read this appeal. And in another condition, participants were exposed to this more emotional appeal involving the photo of one identifiable person. This image was given to us for use in the study by Oxfam International. And this was like one of their most effective images. It turns out that images of children who benefited from giving tend to be more effective actually than images of children who are like suffering. So again, we really stacked the deck in the most fair way that we could. And what we found was, interestingly, I'll skip through some of our methods. Basically, we used a lottery method. We told people they had a chance of winning $100, and they had to pre-commit. If you were randomly selected to win, how much would you want to give and how much would you want to keep for yourself to an effective charity working on global poverty? We tried to do some things to combat AIDS skepticism. And so interestingly, what we found was that the argument performed, first of all, raised donations significantly above no argument for giving, but also didn't lead to statistically significantly lower donations than the emotional appeal. And then we also did some combined appeal conditions, but we didn't find what we were looking for in that case. The thing that's really of interest here is that this rational appeal significantly increased donations over the control. So did the emotional appeal, but the effect of the philosophical argument and the emotional appeal on donations did not differ significantly. And this was a pre-registered study and so on, with power analysis guiding our sample sizes. So it looks like there really wasn't a significant difference between the effects of the argument and this very, very strong emotional appeal. I'll move very quickly through the next one, but basically, we also have compared the effects of these positive and negative duty arguments in some later work. And what we found there was that it looks like negative duty arguments sometimes are actually more motivating than positive duty arguments. These arguments that focus on the harm that we are doing to people in the global south as members of rich Western nations. So some of this research actually seems to provide evidence for and against some of those claims in the global poverty literature. Both arguments seem to motivate giving, and it turns out to be the case that it does look like negative duty arguments can be more giving, more motivationally fruitful. Okay, so that's one dimension of motivational, of the account of what I call normative fruitfulness. We can also consider a second dimension. So it doesn't just matter what happens in terms of what people are motivated to do when they think about morality and justice and related normative matters. It also matters what they are demotivated to do, what they're disincentivized to do. So this is this idea of prevention fruitfulness, how people will be prevented from acting when they internalize certain kinds of moral frameworks. And here I draw on work by people like Keith Payne and Jeanette Kennett and Cordelia Fine in arguing that moral judgments are not just post hoc rationalizations, but can actually help us to regulate our behaviors prospectively. So the fruitfulness of normative concepts, in other words, can be assessed not only in terms of what they directly promote, but also what they prevent in terms of human tendencies to act in ways that are unfair or harmful to others. Okay, so that's our second dimension. Now third, and this is going to draw on some recent research in feminist philosophy by Sally Haslanger. You might ask, when certain concepts, normative concepts, compete with bias and other problematic social phenomena, which ones are more effective in helping us to fight back, right? So Haslanger, in her thinking about the concepts of gender and race in a very prominent article in the journal Nous in 2000, she asked, well, what do we want these concepts to be like, right? We shouldn't just ask what are gender and race, but how might we better think about gender and race? What conceptions of gender and race in my terminology will most help us to oppose misogyny and racism, right? So she says, at the most general level, the task is to develop an accounts of gender and race that will be effective tools in the fight against these relevant forms of injustice. And I agree with Haslanger that these are desiderata for concepts of gender and race, but I just want to emphasize that this practical task of what happens when people internalize these concepts, does it really help them to fight back against problematic social phenomena, has to be evaluated and also evaluable empirically. We can't just speculate about the effects of these conceptions. And we have to also think about their effects on other people, in particular, other groups that are affected by different conceptions of gender, such as trans people and so on. And that's something that Haslanger is, I think, on board with. Okay, a fourth criterion of fruitfulness, which gets to the idea of fragmentation a little bit, is this question of whether certain concepts are better subjects of consensus among people with other commitments that diverge, but who are nonetheless people who have goodwill toward one another and desire peaceful coexistence. So I take this to be the later Rawlsian project. If you know, John Rawls is this very influential political philosopher, and he was thinking in his later work about what kind of theory of justice it would be suitable for a modern multicultural democracy like ours, in which you have members of very, very different religious groups and non-believers and people have all different ways of thinking about the good life. What could they all agree to, despite all of these very deep metaphysical and religious disagreements, in terms of what a more just society would look like? So one way of thinking about this is to think about, can we have pluralism without fragmentation, right? What kinds of ways of thinking about values will produce pluralism without fragmentation? And just interestingly, this is another area of philosophy in which there's been quite a lot of work, although political philosophy has been slow to absorb empirical methods. There's been quite a lot of work looking at whether Rawls's predictions about what kinds of principles people from diverse perspectives would coalesce around are true. It seems like, though his method is very open to empirical analysis, a lot of his predictions were quite wrong. Strikingly, people don't tend to endorse his difference principle for regulating socioeconomic inequalities, but they endorse something more like utilitarianism with a floor. They don't describe it that way, but that's across a large number of experiments. And in some ways, Rawls didn't go far enough. You know, some people have argued that there won't be a uniquely choice-worthy set of principles through a decision procedure like Rawls's original position, where we imagine that we don't know who we are, we don't know whether we're men or women or black or white, and then we try to arrive at which principles are the right ones, not knowing these facts about ourselves. He sort of didn't go far enough because he didn't consider whether or not people would agree on this way of arriving at principles in the first place. Like, is the original position a good way of coming to principles of justice? And that's what Justin Brunner and I tried to explore in another article. And it turns out that I won't spend a lot of time on this, but people tend to think that Adam Smith's idea of an impartial spectator has various benefits over the Rawlsian original position in terms of arriving at principles. So this is research that's trying to examine what I'm calling consensus fruitfulness. And then lastly, the last dimension of the theory, these are meant to be like criterion that we can use as empirical scientists to evaluate ideas, right? To evaluate the importance of philosophical ideas. The last dimension is what I'm calling action guidance or guidance fruitfulness, whether certain concepts provide or help us to formulate more useful prescriptions than others with respect to important practical problems that we must solve. So many philosophers hold that a moral theory should be action guiding, or at least that being action guiding is a strike in a moral theory's favor. Think about the traditional action guiding, this objection to Aristotelian virtue ethics, right? So Aristotle tells us, act as the wise person would act as the virtuous person would act. And people have argued, well, that's going to be empty advice. Like, we need to think about how the virtuous person would act. And I think that's a bad objection. But just like I think the self-effacingness objection to consequentialism is kind of bad. But notice that the good thing about it is that it presupposes that it matters whether or not a theory provides useful action guidance. And in the book, I defend the idea that focusing on moral exemplars, there's a lot of research behind exemplar-based reasoning actually being quite useful and action guiding. There are many other literatures in philosophy that depend on this idea of guidance, fruitfulness mattering. So this huge literature on feasibility in political theory. Feasibility constraints are relevant to practical deliberation, including deliberation about what to do about real-world moral problems. So it seems like when we incorporate feasibility, we're asking for guidance from our theories when we incorporate feasibility constraints into our theorizing. And then relatedly, this distinction that's very common, very prominent in contemporary political philosophy between ideal theory and non-ideal theory is often cashed out in terms of this idea by my sadly recently departed colleague, Charles Mills, but he argued that the point of a non-ideal theory is to help guide us in addressing suboptimal and non-ideal issues with our society. So there's quite a lot of work that I think depends on the thought that guidance fruitfulness matters in the evaluation of philosophical ideas. Okay, so we're up to, so now I've motivated the count, and I want to raise some concerns about whether we can generalize this account to other domains in general. Is this really a theory of normative fruitfulness, or is it a theory of fruitfulness in general? Should we be like thoroughgoing pragmatists where we apply these criteria across the board? Well, recall our starting cases, right? We expect very different things from a theory of subatomic particles than we do from a theory of justice, and we should. Different areas of inquiry respond to different types of problems. And I think that there are three kind of key contrasts between these normative concepts and scientific classificatory concepts that help to show that this theory probably is domain specific to the normative. So what I mean by scientific classificatory concepts are kind of the other kinds of concepts that are focused on a lot in the conceptual engineering literature. Concepts like planet, allele, sex hormone, electron. So one way in which they differ is in terms of their purposes. The primary purpose of normative concepts is not the classification of the natural world, but rather their purposes involve helping us to resolve problems that arise in collective and cooperative living. So our self-interest needs to be mitigated for productive cooperation to occur. Our concern for others needs to be maintained and sometimes increased. We have to correct for inequalities in power and position when they arise, and especially when they produce bad consequences, right? Now, I'm not going to assert like some single purpose for every moral and political concepts. That would be kind of pro-Christian. Any particular concept might defy that purpose. But the purposes that normative concepts serve in solving problems that arise in collective and cooperative living are clearly distinct from the purposes that scientific classificatory concepts serve. To focus on one example, planet, right, is supposed to be used in developing a system for classifying celestial objects, right? So even if one rejects the specific purposes of normative concepts that I've mentioned, it's difficult to view the purposes of scientific inquiry and normative inquiry as entirely the same. So that's purposes. Second, the relevant communities. There's a contrast in the communities to which these concepts are put for use. In the case of scientific concepts, it's primarily the community of scientific experts. While science must sometimes be communicated to the public, so for purposes of policy development or coordination around best practices, it's not the case that in order to be good scientific concepts, they have to be always understandable to the general public. It's no criticism of a given concept or conception of planet, electron, or allele that the ordinary person may have trouble understanding them or employing them in their daily lives. So think about these protests that happened around the time when the International Astronomical Union changed the definition of planet, right? Now, notice that people are having a good time and their placards don't look like the typical protest placards, right? So I think that the joke and the fun part of these protests, right, speaks to the fact that when the IAU decided to introduce a new definition of planet that relegated Pluto to the status of dwarf planet, no serious person would think that this definition needed to be well understood or acceptable to the ordinary person. While some non-scientists protested the decision because the new definition removed Pluto from the list of canonical planets, these protests were primarily in jest, poking fun at the very idea that the scientists should not be the ones who decide what are and are not classified as planets. And in fact, this guy over here is the son of Clyde Tombaugh, who discovered Pluto, and he's even there having a good time. Non-experts simply do not have the standing to make this pronouncement about what counts as a planet. So for technical scientific concepts, including classificatory terms of the kind that Carnap was more focused on, their use is indexed to expert communities and sometimes only these communities. Interestingly, the Illinois State Senate tried to introduce like some kind of resolution saying that this new definition was bad, and they were kind of serious about it. And of course, Tombaugh's family was not part of this effort, but the thought was that, well, Pluto is the only planet discovered by an American, and it's anti-American to change the... And If you're scoffing at that, then you're kind of agreeing with the point that there's something wrong with this way of looking at the motivation for science. But by contrast, many philosophers hold that moral concepts and concepts that bear on social norms have to be graspable and usable by the general public to serve their distinctive purposes. This has to be the case if we expect these concepts to help coordinate behavior and communication among the general public. If only experts can coordinate and communicate using moral concepts, we won't get very far in solving the problems that they're supposed to help us to solve. And then this leads into the third high-level contrast of accountability holding practices. We don't typically blame ordinary people for having the wrong scientific views, but we do hold ordinary people accountable for having the wrong moral views and drawing the wrong moral conclusions. In the case of the small group of non-scientists who genuinely rejected the 2006 revision to the definition of the concept planet, it's failure to defer to the experts that I think we morally criticize, rather than a failure to know the facts about, the reason why the definition was changed, having to do with whether or not Pluto could clear its atmosphere and its size and so on, right? The problem is a lack of intellectual humility, right? Similarly, with masking and vaccines around COVID, I think I'm in safe company, right? We don't blame people for not understanding how vaccines work or how masking works, right? We blame them for the moral failure of not thinking about the risks that they pose to others, and also maybe epistemic moral overlay failure of a lack of humility about one's own expertise and the expertise of scientists. People who promote the wrong moral views and act on them are often subject to blame and held accountable in various ways: ridicule, shaming, punishment. But if a scientific theory is merely incorrectly held by a person and their assent to it involves no foreseeable harm to others, it's not plausible that we're entitled to blame them in the moral sense of the term, let alone sanction or punish them. This maybe aligns with the idea that blame has a certain kind of point. So Miranda Fricker is a philosopher who's argued that the point of the concept of blame, moral blame, is to increase the alignment of the moral understandings of the wrongdoer and the blamer. And note that we couldn't really hold one another accountable or blame one another, aiming to align these understandings, if the concept of blame or other moral concepts that are at play were unwieldy and couldn't be grasped by all the relevant parties. This is not to say that ethics has to be pedestrian. There are surely levels of understanding between the moral theorist, working on nitty-gritty issues in moral philosophy, and that of the ordinary person. But normative concepts have to be subject to the constraint that people can reliably and regularly check themselves and one another using them. So these are some reasons to think that the practical desiderata that I'm applying to normative concepts don't naturally extend to scientific classificatory concepts. And there are all kinds of interesting questions you could ask about hybrid concepts that are partly descriptive and partly, maybe some of you are anticipating, it's like a concept like intelligence, which is, many social scientific concepts are partly descriptive and partly normative. And we can ask interesting questions about how morality should inform our choices around those concepts. And I do a little bit of that in one of the chapters of the book. But for the purpose of showing that this account is not domain general, all I have to do is show that there's this particular, pretty clear contrast between the normative domain and one particular scientific domain. Okay, so one of my favorite parts is the responding to objections part. So I'll respond to just a few key objections. I'll leave more time for you all to give me a hard time later. So the first objection that one gets in putting forward a view like this is that it involves a certain kind of pernicious relativism. So this focus on normative fruitfulness seems to imply that what is fruitful and therefore most choice-worthy in terms of our moral and political concepts could vary across time and place. And that's supposed to be a bad thing because morality is supposed to be objective and binding in all kinds of ways. So I think this is a feature of the view, not a bug, and I think we can avoid some of those worries as well. There's good reason to think that, here's why I think it's a feature. There's good reason to think that moral and political concepts emerge in different times and places as solutions to the particular problems that human beings are facing then and there. And I think this fact helps to explain why some of our contemporary moral thinking, this will kind of come up a little bit in in conversation with Michael and Dan on their book, some of the moral problems that we're facing now, it seems like we don't really have good moral theoretical resources to address them. So climate change looks like that. There's quite a lot of work by people like Matthew Feinberg suggesting that our ordinary moral reasoning just kind of breaks down when it comes to a problem like climate change. There are many reasons why that's the case. Similarly, with like the levels of economic inequality that we're seeing, jars against some of the roughly 18th century and 17th century developments in moral theory around strong property rights, limits of government intervention, right, that developed to solve other kinds of social problems, I would argue. But also the theory is only partially relativistic in this way because many problems are completely general to human societies. All societies have to deal with finding acceptable divisions of resources, dealing with inadequate altruism, and so on. Some of these problems are ones that we inevitably have to solve as moral agents interacting with one another and other sentient creatures. Sometimes similar solutions, similar concepts will work on the same problem in different contexts. It's also possible that different contexts will require different theories or solutions for the same problems. But notice that there is also a kind of objectivity built into the theory in that our context, our cultures, right, our environments are not walled off from one another. So there is always the meta-moral problem. What do you do when your interactions bridge a gap between two different communities? So we have to think about what are the most fruitful ways for people from different cultures interacting with one another, and that will not be a relativistic enterprise, at least in terms of space. It might be relativistic in terms of time. So over time, that could change. A second objection, maybe the only one I'll have time to address, is that this theory is going to be overly concessive. And this is a really big concern for theorists like Jerry Cohen and David Estland, that if we make our theorizing about justice, they're focused on in particular, too responsive to empirical facts about human nature, it's going to lead us to downgrade our moral expectations of humans. So, if you're sort of like, well, we find through empirical research that we can't motivate people to care about X. Does that therefore show that people are not required to care about X? Of course not, right? That would be like allowing the science to kind of water down our moral requirements. But notice that attention to empirical facts about human nature need not be used only to excuse our moral failings. Instead, empirical research can be used to explore which moral and political concepts will tend to produce and promote the best kinds of human behavior, the strongest forms of cooperation, and so on. So in slogan form, I like to think of this as a focus on optimization rather than concession. And just lastly, David Enoch often says that this kind of approach leads us to us not taking morality seriously enough, that this view is at odds with the level of commitment and conviction of people who are engaged in on-the-ground moral disagreement. Like when I disagree with Michael about some moral matter, it's not that we're just disagreeing about which way of looking at things is more fruitful. We actually disagree about what is right and wrong proper. It's true that those making moral claims, especially in the context of important moral problems, from the inside will often take their moral concepts to be the only ones. And they might not be able to attend to the practical roles that these concepts play in their cognitive economy or in society as a whole. So in this way, fruitfulness concerns might be self-effacing in everyday moral judgment. They might actually need to be in order to be fruitful. In order for people to be sufficiently motivated, they might need to not be thinking about the practical effects of their ways of thinking about values, right? I see no reason to think that this is the case for everyone. There are plenty of pragmatists who have been very involved in social causes despite having a very robust view of the importance of evaluating values and other kinds of items in terms of practical factors. Further, it seems like it's just the case that social practices work this way in general, that they have this feature that we can take the internal perspective on the practice and act in accordance with its norms, and we can also step back and think about the value of that practice in a different mood. So the batter in baseball at the plate is not going to be thinking perhaps about whether or not this is the way that baseball should be played and should these rules be changed. That doesn't in any way demotivate them from swinging at the ball when they're at the plate, right? But surely they can, after the game, think about whether or not baseball should be changed in various ways. We still need to be able to step back from our moral practices and concepts and determine whether they're really fulfilling the functions that they're supposed to, whether they're helping us to solve the problems we need them to help us solve. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with just the important upshots. One of the benefits of this view is that we get a new account of the way that science, and the kind of science that a lot of people in this room do, can inform philosophical ethics. We get an explanation of why empirical research is part of, rather than merely of side interest to, moral and political philosophy tied to deep tendencies in these areas. This theory might be generalizable to other domains, but there are difficulties for such a view, as I've said. This opens up the recursive question of, is it better for a theory of fruitfulness to be broader or narrower on its own terms? But on this narrower account that I've offered, I want to suggest that maybe accuracy is improved, even if generality is reduced. Notably, we don't have to go in for a full-on pragmatism about all concepts to get a plausible account of why fruitfulness matters in the evaluation of normative concepts, and why empirical research is therefore part of moral and political philosophy. Of course, I'd welcome it if this account was purely domain general. That would be a really nice thing for me. Just not going to hold my breath. And even if such a project could be pulled off, I'll end on this. It's really important not to lose sight of what is distinctive about the fruitfulness of normative concepts. So I'll thank my collaborators on various papers that I mentioned. And also, thank all of you. And there's the book and a way to get it for a slightly lower price if you're interested in purchasing a copy. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. So the format will be, Anne and I both have some brief responses, and then we'll open it up for questions. Given the time, it is about 3:45. We started a few minutes late because it's a weekend. And so we'll go for about 15 minutes or so, I think. And then there will be time for plenty of questions as well. So, yeah. Slides or?
If you're comfortable, why don't y'all go sit?
Yeah, that works. Yeah.
But I will have to have someone let me know through these slides. Do you want to jump first?
Do your preference. Okay. Then I guess I will just make a couple of quick comments. Again, fascinating as someone who works in psychology and social psychology and interdisciplinary moral psychology. I think the topic of your book is quite fascinating. Long been interested in how can psychology inform philosophy? How can philosophy inform psychology? I think a few comments that I had in reading through your book. One was to sort of gently push a little bit on the distinction between normative concepts and scientific concepts. And I think you alluded to this when talking about intelligence as one social scientific concept that obviously is sort of in this interesting gray area where it admits of certain normative construals and yet is studied in very concrete ways by scientists. So I myself am an empathy researcher. And so empathy, as if you're at all aware of the empathy space in social sciences, is very controversial, how we define it, how we think about it. And many of the concepts in social science and social psychology specifically, we have had several crises in our field where the self-referential, reflexive nature of the things we are studying has come into question. Within theory and psychology as well, a lot of discussion about how, as like the science of human experience, social psychology is very vulnerable to that kind of concern. And how we as scientists think about and carve out constructs and make sense of natural kinds in the world, how we do that can be obviously very important for us to do, but uniquely sensitive because of how we interface with the public. So if, for example, I or other scientists say that empathy must mean this thing, and I'm defining the concept in this very concrete way, but it doesn't necessarily cohere with how the everyday user or NPR listener, thinks about what they think of as empathy. How does any disjunct between what I'm saying and the taxonomy I'm saying matters for what counts as real in someone's experiences, if it butts up against theirs, how does and should that matter? And I think there are definitely some in the field who are more in the perspective that it really, as scientists, we have the expertise to carve out the world in the way we see fit. But I think there are also plenty who think that we do need to think about alignment between our taxonomies and everyday experience. I think there are several concrete applications you can think of this with. I think like the AI empathy one is a particular recent kind of example where how we decide what empathy in different human technology interactions, is it real empathy or something else? But there are plenty of others. And so I would be curious to hear your thoughts about that. I mean, I love the idea of conceptual engineering and the different variants of it, the Carnap and Haslanger approaches you talk about in your book. And I think it's a lot of social psychologists and other social scientists are kind of deep in that right now, trying to think about meta theoretically, how do we engage in that? But I think in a way that it is this interesting blend of the normative and the descriptive. But I'll stop there. It's a rich book, a lot of interesting ideas, but I'll stop there.
And I guess if I could still hear mine. I came this morning, and this is a very anthropologist thing to say. I realized there were different norms in the room for discussant behavior. So I went ahead and made a slideshow, not being sure what was going to happen this afternoon. So I'll go ahead and share my slides. All right, so let me go ahead and share. All right, and we'll see if I can get it the second time. Let's see if I've learned here. Okay, great. And then should be right here. Awesome. All right, good. Got it the second time. So Matt, thank you for sharing with us today. Thank you for sharing your book with us. Now, I have to say as a disclaimer for those of you who see Matt's book, who have already read it, you'll see in the introduction that Matt's very specific, that he's not trying to speak for anthropology. And that's partially just to keep things kind of, tractable for the book itself. But what I'm going to do here is also kind of bring in some of that anthropological perspective, because I know it's there for you. I see it, a lot of our overlapping disciplinary perspectives. So what I'm going to do for y'all, just so you know, so I'm going to be wearing the hat of anthropology right now, so not just an evolutionary anthropologist. And I'm going to wear the hat of an anthropologist working in communities where there tend to be power dynamics between the anthropologist and the community. So that's often if the anthropologist is from a higher SES, for example, or from a higher income country. So when we think about what should be involved in knowledge application as anthropologists, we can see a lot of parallels to what's actually going on in philosophy, and we're getting stuck on some of the same things. So I wanted to highlight those things for those of you who are interested and also for our conversation. So the first thing is very similar to what we see in philosophy, if I understand correctly, which is that we all agree that we should focus on cumulative knowledge. But we don't necessarily agree on how we should do that. So some of us are really interested in creating cumulative knowledge by engaging with thinkers from past and present, sticking really close to the theory, and really kind of having that experience of knowledge production. Others are doing empirics, right? So they're interested in the science is cumulative type approach, if you've heard that phrase. And so we're all being cumulative, but in different ways. And this break, of course, has been studied by philosophers of science, so I'm not the first one to say this, but this is going on in anthropology much as it is in other humanities and social sciences. The second thing is the question of whether we should intervene. I believe, if I understand correctly, this is very similar to some of the consequentialism we just talked about. And if we're thinking about anthropology from a philosophy of science perspective, we also see two kinds of camps here. And we use phrases similar to the ones that Matt uses in his book to describe ourselves. So we'll think about theoretical virtues, for example, and whether those should be applied or not, and then problem solving and whether we should be solving problems or not. And what's really interesting is that there are groups in anthropology that support non-intervention with different motivations in terms of what they're thinking. So one of the spaces I work in, I work often in development anthropology. And what we do is we're often working with anthropological techniques, but with international NGOs. And what we're often thinking is, well, look, the international NGOs are going to be there anyway, so let's kind of try to guide from within in terms of making sure community needs are being met, et cetera, kind of pull in some of that, that cultural perspective, that local perspective there. Other folks are actually anthropologists of development, which is actually a critical perspective. And that group often will hold, for example, that it's actually unethical to work with international NGOs, partially because it's advancing imperialism. And it helps to displace cultural practices that are already there through that action. And so you can see us kind of grappling with some of the same things. Should we intervene or not? And oftentimes it's falling along the, are we going for practical applications, or are we kind of sticking close to the theory? It often falls along those lines. So again, Matt's careful to say he doesn't want to speak for other disciplines, but I see some parallels here. And knowing that fragmentations in philosophy are similar to the ones in other humanities and social sciences, to kind of pull in that thread from today, Matt's modeling a way of building bridges between theoreticians and empiricists. And so one question maybe for discussion today is, how might we generalize from Matt's approach to dialogues about when and how to apply theory in other fields like anthropology? And then the second kind of theme that I wanted to chat about today as a discussant is pulling in a bit of the 5 approaches, 5 concepts of moral fruitfulness, normative fruitfulness here as well. So Matt and I both share an interest in cross-cultural research on philosophy of the mind. We both believe that human norms solve kind of key adaptive problems, as he just told us. Some of those are universal, and some of them can vary around the world. There's diversity in moral models around the world, as we've both been working on. And concepts may or may not translate across spaces and time. So even as globalization's happening, we still see differences. So when I think about motivation, prevention, resilience, consensus, and guidance for fruitfulness, I think a lot about the matching concepts from anthropology and how we grapple with those. So for the first 2, and if I'm oversimplifying, I apologize. So motivation and prevention, I think about as some of these kinds of key moral concepts that are often coming on board for kiddos between like 3 and 5 years old. They are often really good at should versus should not, and we see this cross-culturally. And so that's really kind of something we see, I dare say, a human universal in terms of development. So that's very much there, and something anthros are thinking about. In the space called cultural evolution, which is something anthropologists do, we often also look at the maintenance of traits. And I think this is a parallel here to the idea of resilience. So are traits maintained in the face of other traits that may come in, for example, from imperialism? Do they persist? And if they do, then they're resilient. So I think that is a parallel there to that second concept. And then the third one, consensus, this is something we work on often through a concept called cultural consensus, which isn't to say that there's a right or wrong way, but that if you basically use something called cultural consensus analysis with a group of people, you can find out what the centroid is, what the kind of center of gravity is for what people agree is normative and the way of doing things. So that's cultural consensus there. But the fifth one, guidance fruitfulness, this is where anthropologists sometimes get really hung up. And this may be partially because we might think of this as something like application or even activism. And this is because it selects the problems to solve and the solutions for it. So I want to say really briefly, I feel like I'm being long-winded. Hopefully this is helpful for discussion. But basically what this does is potentially selects for problems and how to solve. And this is where academic anthropologists, whether we're critical or non-critical in our approach, we tend to get a little bit caught up in things like moral relativism. And you saw us coming. You talked about relativism, so thank you for that. So as Matt mentioned, moral values need to be understandable to the people who are using them, and that could vary across places and time, as you've mentioned. And when we're thinking about who is the general public, for example, who needs to be using these traits, we need to think about different kinds of publics, which Matt mentioned. But anthropologists will still squirm a little bit about offering solutions, even if they're locally appropriate normative concepts that promote goodwill, which is something that you mentioned there. For the reasons that I've identified, unless communities are engaged and actually request the intervention, anthropologists will often have this kind of intuition that they don't want to get involved. It feels a little imperialistic. It feels a little bit like we're not respecting cultural difference, basically. Even if communities are walled off from one another and globalization is happening, anthropologists will always want to see agency, for example, there in communities requesting the interventions. So the question I guess I have for the group, and you've already anticipated this, but perhaps we can continue to discuss, there's no answer. I mean, it's as old as Western philosophy, but how do we continue to navigate the ethics of, there's an of missing there, of intervention? And I think this is closely related to consequentialism, but maybe we can continue to dig in as social scientists of how we navigate this space. All right, thank you.
Thanks for these very helpful comments. I really appreciate the care that you both took with this book, and a lot of your suggestions are very helpful. I want to just pair a couple of them, and I'll try to be as brief as possible to leave room for anyone else to ask questions. The focus on power dynamics shares something in common with some of these worries that anthropologists have about intervention, right? The power dynamic between the researcher and the participants, which hopefully we don't call subjects anymore. Yeah, so I think that, and I say this at one point in the book, but I think I could do more. I hope that the fruitfulness approach and empirical approaches to moral and political philosophy push us more in the direction of emphasizing the agency and on-the-ground effects on affected communities than philosophy has traditionally been. I think when we think about fruitfulness, when we think about what these concepts do in the real world, that should lead us to be guided by some of these concerns about imperialism and about assuming that our forms of expertise are the only ones. Such as there's much more to say, but that's the briefest responses that I hope that this theory can actually be more in the direction of that than less. Another thing to note, and I live with someone who's very focused on the role of imperialism and aid and kind of how these things are. I think that it's really important to think about how the kinds of interventions or the kinds of ways of trying to help people and engage in solidarity with them affect them need not always encourage imperialism, right? You could think about which NGOs or which kinds of organizations to give to, partly in terms of which ones promote agency and which ones are going to have, more long-term effects than just kinds of the whichever NGOs, sometimes that's going to go against the recommendations of effective altruism and the things that have the most measurable, short-term impacts. And I'm happy with that. I think that there are good internal moral reasons to support those kinds of approaches sometimes over the ones that, get emphasized as most cost-effective and so on. And just one more thing to stay kind of brief to Daryl's point. I really think it's nice to think about how you've done some really interesting work on empathy and thinking about the emergent understandings of empathy in the context of AI and AI companions and so on. And I think that that's another area that I do have to think more about, but I hope that the theory is, again, more in the direction of considering these effects on the public than less. It does problematize an overly stark division between descriptive and normative concepts, but I hope that if we're thinking about if we think empathy is partly a normative concept, or at least has normative content, then some of these questions about the practical effects of different conceptions of empathy and whether they leave out people who will be greatly benefited, for instance, by AI companions, that should be like something that the theory itself recommends that we focus on. And maybe I wasn't always as clear about that as I should have been, but that's something that I hope is very compatible with or even encouraged by my general orientation. Thanks so much.
So we have time for probably 5 or 6 minutes for questions. If I'll pass it around a little bit.
Thanks for this. Thanks for the discussion. This was great. So I just wanted to push a little bit more on the analogies and disanalogies between science and moral theory. Maybe a lens with which to think about it is like what role you see for moral expertise and the kind of deference that the folk should have to moral experts. And if there's some analogy to the way Sellers sets up, there's sort of like the scientific image of the world, and then there's the manifest image of the world, and there's two different sets of concepts with which to think about the subject matter. But we don't expect the folk to be conversant in the concepts of the scientific image. Is there something analogous to like the moral expert image, and should we defer to people who have really good expertise about the effects of vaccines or how to think about, policy prescriptions which apply to populations rather than ethical concepts with how to live with respect to how to live your life? That was open-ended, but feel free to riff.
No, that's really helpful. I guess I don't think that only moral and political theorists are moral experts, and sometimes there are occupational hazards of, that's more of a joke. But no, I think that carefully studying moral matters does yield certain kinds of expertise, right? Just as carefully studying all kinds of matters does. But it's not necessarily going to be the case that all of the people who are the most important moral experts to draw on are people in the academy. In particular, I think if you look at the literature, one way in this comes out, if you look at the literature on moral exemplars or extraordinary altruists, that's like really important work, focusing on like people who donate organs to strangers or people who give like 10% of their income to people across the world. And that is one way of looking at what a moral expert is or what the best kind of moral agent is. But I really tend to think that that leaves out some of the bravest and most impactful people who we should be including in the discussion, like including the woman in the polka dot dress or, tank men. So I think activists, I think people who are doing important work in communities, organizing, they're moral experts in a kind of way because they're most engaged with social movements and moral causes. And so I wouldn't think that a focus on moral expertise necessarily means expertise in moral philosophy. That's a really rich question, but we could talk more about.
Yes, thanks. Thank you very much for that, your book and the discussion. I have a lot of questions because of the richness of your books, but I'll only ask one. You, in your presentation, ran together things like concepts, theories, principles, and I would add arguments to stand in for the philosophical enterprise, and then asked, what are the effects of those things, and had a very wonderful and a powerful set of questions about that. But I would think that I think it's a different way of understanding the philosophical project, more of a kind of constructivist one, but we can classify it later. Namely that what people are guided by are concepts and operationalized concepts like good, fairness, and by people I mean everybody. And they may or may not be universal depending on how we operationalize them. But then what philosophers do is unpack those into theoretical structures that both explain their power and justify them, but not externally. That is, capture the justificatory power they already have. I mean, you mentioned Rawls, what he says, and especially later Rawls, he says, this is a theory about concepts a freedom and equality that we already share. The we is contestable, but nevertheless. So I'm wondering how your critique fits into that picture, because there are some of the I think it can, but some of the examples you gave our judgment about them would vary according to whether we're talking about a theory's effectiveness, a concept's effectiveness, or a mode of argumentation. The Singer example, for example, seems to be about mode of argumentation. Like presenting an argument, rational argument is one way, presenting an exemplar is another way. But you could really subsume both of those under a broadly consequentialist or benevolence/consequentialist theory about what the obligation is. So I'm wondering what happens if we disaggregate or disambiguate those aspects of the enterprise.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I have to give it more thought. I suppose that I like conceiving of part of the task of philosophy as capturing, as in your words, the justificatory power that people's concepts already have. And then there's still going to be this really important role for empirical research in the enterprise conceived as such, which is to ask, are these actually the concepts that people really have? Or are they theory-laden or theory-distorted versions that philosophers are introducing? Further, there's this question that I think the fruitfulness approach really wants to put its finger on is, are they the concepts that people should have? I don't think that all ordinary, so this is one way in which I might veer a little bit away from the ordinary moral judgments, at least in the society that I live in, is to ask, are we really thinking about right and wrong in the right ways? And should we be trying to reform our moral thinking? And I'm trying to, I guess I think that we should try to get a handle on what a framework would look like for doing that kind of reforming of our moral approach, because it looks like sometimes our moral thought is leading to, pretty bad outcomes and ways of relating to one another. But I do think that is an important part of the philosophical enterprise, just capturing the justificatory power that people's concepts already have. And the last thing I'll say about that is that giving people a rational reconstruction of the concepts and emotional responses that they have to real world problems is a way in which philosophy can be impactful. People are, especially in the US, I see a lot of students in particular when we come to these debates, maybe students at Brooklyn College who are traditionally not as privileged always, sort of thinking, well, yeah, I agree with these moral ideas, but I've been a lot of people have told me that I would become a sucker if I became too altruistic and so on. So giving people that kind of rational reconstruction can be very powerful in kind of steeling themselves against, these kinds of harmful, more antisocial ways of looking at morality. Thank you.
Last two questions.
Thanks, Matt. I have a sort of annoying philosopher kind of question.
Michael's questions have already improved my book, just to be clear. So
Thanks.
Go ahead.
That's nice of you to say. It's actually two versions of a question that are distinct, but I think related, and they're both about evaluating the fruitfulness of a theory. And so the first one is, I guess, the way I would put it is a problem of evaluating the implementation versus evaluating the theory. So imagine, I don't know, I was trying to think of what's the right example to make this point, but so Marx has certain concepts of justice or whatever, right? And we want to evaluate whether his ideas were fruitful. And so someone of a particular political stripe might come along and be like, well, it led to Stalinism, so it's bad. And then another person might be like, well, that's just a perversion of the ideas. The problem was the implementation. And so, how do we assess when a normative theory is itself bad versus its implementation being bad? The other version of the question is about timescales. So I could also, using the same example, I could imagine someone who really loves liberalism, in the small L political theory sense, saying something well, Marx's views were really good because we tried them and they were disastrous. And so the reason that's good is because it made way for liberalism to win the day or something like that. And so in the fullness of time, the fruitfulness of what looked like a bad theory is actually good. And the last thing I'll say is that I'm not trying to say either of those thoughts are meant to make it that we can't evaluate the fruitfulness of a normative concept, but it actually might make the evaluation look a little more similar to the way we evaluate scientific concepts, because we have those exact same problems in evaluating scientific theories, right? So the first one is the relationship between theory and evidence, and that we don't actually ever find the definitive experiment, but we actually have to consider things holistically. And then there's all kinds of examples, so far as I know, in the history of science where it looked like some theory was discredited, and then over time it actually seemed like it had something right. So the example that popped into my mind was something I got from Carl Zimmer's book on virology, where his argument is that virologists were like super slow over the 20th century to acknowledge that viruses could be airborne because they were so afraid of seeming like they were miasma theorists. And so they like discredited any ideas that viruses could float around in the air because like these social forces. But in reality, like a lot of the careful work that the 19th century miasmatic thinkers were doing about how stuff travels around, even though they had some things very, very wrong, they actually had some things right. And so in the fullness of time, like how do we do those evaluations? So I'm just wondering if those two considerations actually pull normative and scientific concepts a little closer together when we evaluate their fruitfulness.
Yeah, these are super interesting questions that I have to think more about. I tend to focus on fruitfulness considerations that I've already kind of pulled out of existing philosophical debates, like disagreements about which kinds of arguments will be more motivating in global poverty, or disagreements about which kinds of conceptions of justice will be more likely to lead to stable consensus. And and that simplifies my task, but you've put your finger on some of the ways in which the task is very, very difficult. So one thing I would say about the second point about time scales and in the fullness of time, so let's take the toy example of, maybe Marxism in the fullness of time, if you're an anti-Marxist or something, is good because it revealed itself to be so bad. And then, something about the marketplace of ideas. And, now we know that, liberal capitalism is the best thing ever. So one thing that I say about, if you're going to evaluate the consequences of a theory, I want to limit fruitfulness considerations to consequences that are internal to the theory in some ways rather than external, right? So you wouldn't want it to be the case, imagine you had like a theory of distributive justice that had some kind of far-flung, when it's disseminated, has some kind of far-flung effects on the kinds of, the value of art that people make, or on teen smoking rates or something like that. Those kinds of consequences don't really in any obvious way bear on whether or not it's a good theory of justice, at least you might argue. So there's a kind of relevance constraint that I try to introduce. And then we can argue about whether or not this kind of consequence, this long-run consequence of Marxism, is like part of Marxism, right? Or just is it just actually the value of the marketplace of ideas that we're pointing to when we show that Marxism has supposedly failed in this way? And then back to, now I'm going to do the defending Marxism a little bit thing, at least. Well, not directly. So this thing about the theory, whether we're evaluating the theory versus its implementation was your first point. It's a really good point. So one thing that we'll want to be really careful about when we distinguish between whether or not the theory is good or whether its implementation is bad, and this is where it's slightly defensive of Marxism, because what Marxists will often point to is the fact that Marx made very different recommendations than many of these, thought the revolution should happen in Germany and that you needed to move through capitalism and so on, right? So, we also have to think about not just kind of the consequences of the theory from its detractors, but also from its proponents, like all of the liberation movements that have been Marxist, and the fact that this is not a very long time scale. So anyway, none of this is meant to defend Marxism, especially not on video in contemporary America. Rather, it's just a point to some of the theoretical considerations that lead us to, these are kind of my more theoretical responses to the distinction between evaluating the theory and the implementation, and your concern about timescale. Thanks.
Hi, I'm trying to think of what the opposite of an annoying question from a philosopher is. Maybe an inspiring question from a media studies scholar. But I'm thinking, and I'm just really excited about today and to think more about what folks have all presented. But I'm inspired, Mary Beth, by the emotional labor Ray block of, I'm actually inspired by the emotional labor of creating a normative concept. So, because I think there's a lot of work that goes into creating a moral concept. And I feel like if you've done any organizing, also low-key, we are having a union election right now. Get your ballots in, people. You need to persuade people. I have found that sometimes you need to have these conversations and persuade people that their pay is a moral concept, right? And that there's really inspirational value in defining something as a moral concept. Even now, I am a cranky Marxist or an inspiring Marxist, but I do think a lot of the structural issues that really fire me up, they're moral issues, right? And I teach my students this in the classroom, and we learn. So I teach a class, Political Economy of Communications, and one of the aspects of critical political economy they learn is the moral. It's a moral. We're concerned with structural, holistic, historical problems from a moral standpoint that altogether our analysis informs action. So I feel like I have a lot in common. Like, we could talk, even though I didn't really think walking in here today, what is a feminist Marxist doing in a philosophical ethical conference like this? But I looked at the papers and I thought, no, this is really relevant. And I just think there should be more like cross discussion here. I think there's a fruitfulness of moral conceptualizing. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's so much liberation to be had from convincing people, and that's the labor part, that their suffering is a moral problem. Because a lot of people just do it in isolation and they don't question it. They just think they already understand it as a structural problem. The challenge is to convince them it's a moral problem. And then I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, excellent. And I think we're on the same page in a lot of ways. I think this trend in philosophy toward thinking about the practical effects of our theorizing really needs to like own up to its debt to the critical theorists and their idea that theories ought to be liberatory, like at least theories of justice and capitalism and so on, that there's a point to theorizing, that it can reveal things like false consciousness, can reveal ways in which people have more in common with people that they think are their enemies, right? That's a really important feature of a lot of recent philosophy that I think philosophy in the 20th century forgot about, and at least analytic philosophy. But related to, I really like the point about emotional labor or just the labor of creating normative understandings. My colleagues, Anna Gantman and Jordan Wiley, have done some recent work pointing out that the expectations on women in terms of being morally good and doing more, the labor of moral communities is so much higher than on men in general. And so that itself is something to think about. Who's going to do the work of reforming our moral thinking, and who should, how that all plays out is a moral issue itself. Lastly, I thought like that, that there's moral value to sort of, to a given domain where we might have thought it was just kind of like purely given or not a moral issue. One of the great examples of that comes out of feminist theory, where we see that, care work is not just something that nature has assigned as women's work, right? That's something that we have a choice over, and how we conceptualize care work and care responsibility, what theories of that we actually accept. That's a question that the fruitfulness approach really welcomes as a, how does this impact people that we think of care in this gendered way versus a more egalitarian way? So I hope that, my general approach can be like really receptive to some of those like really important points.